The fluorescent lights of Murphy's all-night diner cast a harsh glow over the worn linoleum floor, creating shadows that seemed to dance with the cigarette smoke drifting from the corner booth. It was 3:17 in the morning on a Tuesday in November, and the world outside felt as cold and unforgiving as the steel of the railway tracks that ran parallel to Route 61, just beyond the parking lot, where a lone figure sat hunched over a battered guitar case. Bob Dylan pulled his wool coat tighter around his shoulders as he stepped through the diner's glass door, the brass bell above announcing his arrival with a tired chime that had been welcoming travelers for decades. The warmth hit his face immediately, carrying with it the familiar sense of coffee that had been brewing too long and bacon grease that had seen too many mornings. He chose a booth near the window, one that offered a clear view of the man outside with the guitar. The waitress approached, with the weary grace of someone who had been on her feet for hours. Her name tag read Sarah, and despite the exhaustion etched in the lines around her eyes, she managed a genuine smile. She was perhaps 55, with greying auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and hands that spoke of a lifetime of honest work. "Coffee?" she asked, already reaching for the pot she carried like an extension of herself. Bob nodded, studying her face in the amber light. There was something familiar about her, though he couldn't place it. Maybe it was just the universal recognition of someone who understood what it meant to work through the night while the rest of the world slept. "You see that fellow out there much?" Bob asked, gesturing toward the window. Sarah glanced outside and her expression softened. "Tommy? Yeah, he's here most nights. Used to be in Vietnam. Comes back from wherever he spends his days and plays for whoever will listen. Sometimes folks throw him $1 or $2. Sometimes they just pretend he's not there." She poured the coffee with practiced precision, never spilling a drop despite the slight tremor in her hands that spoke of too much caffeine and not enough rest. "He's got real talent, though. Plays things that, well, they get to you, you know. Music that sounds like it comes from somewhere deep." Bob sipped his coffee and watched through the window as Tommy adjusted his position on the concrete step, his fingers finding their way across the strings of an acoustic guitar that had seen better decades. Even through the glass and the ambient noise of the diner, the melody was hauntingly beautiful, filled with the kind of longing that could only come from someone who had lost more than most people ever had to begin with. "What's his story?" Bob asked, settling back in the vinyl booth. Sarah refilled his cup without being asked, a gesture that spoke of genuine hospitality rather than mere professional courtesy. "Nobody knows the whole thing, really. He showed up about 6 months ago, maybe 7. Doesn't talk much about where he came from or where he's going. Just plays that guitar like his life depends on it." She paused, glancing around the nearly empty diner before continuing in a lower voice. "I've seen him go 3 days without eating, just to keep that guitar in tune. Spends what little money he gets on new strings instead of food. It's like that music is the only thing keeping him connected to who he used to be." The door chimed again as a couple of truck drivers entered, their conversation loud and profane as they made their way to the counter. Sarah excused herself to tend to them, leaving Bob alone with his thoughts and the distant sound of Tommy's guitar filtering through the window. Bob had encountered countless musicians over the years, from the coffee houses of Greenwich Village to the concert halls of Europe. He had seen talent in its rawest form and witnessed the way music could transform both the performer and the audience. But there was something about this solitary figure playing for no one in particular that stirred something deep within him, something he hadn't felt in years. The coffee was bitter and strong, the way it should be at 3 in the morning. Bob found himself falling into the rhythm of Tommy's playing, his own internal metronome syncing with the gentle strumming that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the night itself. It was hypnotic, meditative, the kind of music that made you forget about time and place and simply exist in the moment. Sarah returned with a slice of apple pie she hadn't been asked for, setting it down with a motherly authority that brooked no argument. "On the house," she said simply. "You look like you could use something sweet." Bob smiled, recognizing the gesture for what it was. Not charity, but the kind of human kindness that still existed in places like this, in the spaces between the rushing world where people still took time to notice each other. "You're very kind," he said, and meant it. "My mama always said there's enough bitterness in the world without adding to it," Sarah replied, wiping down the table with a rag that had seen countless similar conversations. "Besides, there's something about you that reminds me of, well, someone I used to know." She hesitated, as if deciding whether to continue, then seemed to make up her mind. "You ever hear of a song called The Weight by The Band?" Bob nearly choked on his coffee. Of course he knew the song. He had practically lived with the band for years, had watched them create magic in basements and studios across the country. "Yeah," he said carefully, "I know it. Well, there's a line in there about taking a load off, you know, about helping someone carry their burden for a while." Sarah glanced toward the window again, where Tommy continued his solitary concert. "I always thought that was what music was really about. Not the fame or the money or any of that, but just helping people carry their load for a little while." Bob followed her gaze, watching as Tommy's fingers moved across the fretboard with the kind of muscle memory that comes from years of dedication. The man was clearly skilled, his technique clean and precise despite the cold that must have been numbing his hands. But more than that, there was an emotional honesty in his playing that couldn't be taught or manufactured. "He ever play inside?" Bob asked. Sarah shook her head. "Says he doesn't want to bother the customers. I've offered plenty of times, especially when it gets real cold like tonight, but he always declines. Says the music sounds different under an open sky, even if it's just a parking lot sky." The truck drivers finished their meal and left, their diesel engines rumbling to life outside and casting brief shadows across Tommy as they pulled back onto the highway. The diner fell quiet again, leaving only the soft sounds of Sarah cleaning glasses and the distant melody that seemed to weave itself into the very fabric of the night. Bob found himself thinking about his own journey, about all the nights he had spent in places like this, searching for something he couldn't quite name. He thought about the songs he had written about characters like Tommy, about people on the margins who carried their stories in the lines of their faces and the calluses on their fingers. But here was the real thing, not a character in a song, but a flesh-and-blood human being with his own dreams and disappointments, his own reasons for sitting alone in a parking lot at 3 a.m. "Mind if I go talk to him?" Bob asked, finishing the last bite of pie. Sarah looked surprised. "Most people just pretend he's not there. Are you sure?" "I'm sure." Bob left a $20 bill on the table, far more than necessary for coffee and pie, and made his way toward the door. Sarah watched him go with a curious expression, as if trying to solve a puzzle she couldn't quite figure out. The cold hit him immediately as he stepped outside, the November air sharp and clean after the warmth of the diner. Tommy looked up as Bob approached, his fingers never stopping their movement across the strings. Up close, Bob could see the details that distance had obscured, the careful way Tommy had patched holes in his jacket with duct tape, the military dog tags that caught the light from the diner's neon sign, the deep lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and hard-won wisdom. "Mind if I listen for a while?" Bob asked, gesturing to a spot on the concrete step. Tommy studied him for a moment, taking in Bob's expensive coat and well-maintained boots, clearly trying to figure out what would bring someone like him out into the cold to sit with a homeless veteran. "Free country," Tommy said finally, his voice rough from disuse and cold air. Bob settled beside him, close enough to appreciate the intricacy of Tommy's finger-picking, but far enough away to respect his space. The music was even more beautiful up close, each note clear and purposeful, building into melodies that seemed to tell stories without words. They sat in comfortable silence for perhaps 20 minutes, two musicians connected by the universal language that transcended social boundaries and economic circumstances. Tommy played songs that seemed to come from the deep well of American music, Folk melodies that could have been written yesterday or 100 years ago, blues progressions that carried the weight of generations, country licks that spoke of wide open spaces and simpler times. "That's beautiful," Bob said during a pause between songs. "You write that?" Tommy nodded, a slight flush coloring his weathered cheeks. "It's called Sarah's Song. Named it after the lady in there." He gestured toward the diner with a slight nod. "She's been good to me, you know. Lets me use the restroom, brings me coffee sometimes when the manager's not looking. Figure she deserves a song." Bob felt something shift inside his chest, a recognition of the kind of human decency that seemed increasingly rare in the world. Here was a man who had nothing, living on the margins of society, and his response was to create something beautiful in honor of someone who had shown him simple kindness. "You mind playing it again?" Bob asked. Tommy's fingers found the opening chord, and Bob closed his eyes, letting the melody wash over him. It was a simple song, built around a basic chord progression, but there was something profound in its simplicity. The melody seemed to capture Sarah's gentle strength, her quiet dignity, the way she moved through the world with grace, despite whatever hardship she might be carrying. When the song ended, Bob opened his eyes to find Tommy watching him with a curious expression. "You play?" Tommy asked. "A little," Bob replied, which was perhaps the understatement of the century. Tommy considered this for a moment, then held out his guitar. "Want to try something?" Bob hesitated. The guitar was clearly Tommy's most precious possession, probably the only thing of real value he owned. To offer it to a stranger was an act of trust that went beyond mere politeness. "You sure?" "Music's meant to be shared," Tommy said simply. Bob accepted the guitar, feeling the worn, smooth spots on the neck where Tommy's fingers had worn away the finish. The instrument was old, but well maintained, tuned perfectly despite the cold. Bob's fingers found the familiar positions, muscle memory taking over as he began to play. He chose "The Times They Are A-Changin'," partly as a test to see if Tommy would recognize it, partly because it felt appropriate for the moment. The song had always been about more than social change. It was about the constant flux of life, the way circumstances could shift in unexpected ways, the importance of staying open to possibility even when everything seemed fixed and immutable. Tommy's eyes widened as he recognized the song, and Bob could see the exact moment when recognition shifted to understanding. Tommy knew who he was. But instead of the usual reaction Bob had come to expect, the excitement, the requests for autographs or photos, the sudden change in dynamic that fame inevitably brought, Tommy simply nodded with quiet appreciation, as if Bob's identity was interesting but not particularly surprising. "Thought you looked familiar," Tommy said when the song ended. "Wasn't sure, though. You look different without all the—" He made a vague gesture around his face, presumably referring to the various hairstyles and personas Bob had adopted over the years. "Different time, different place," Bob said, handing back the guitar. "But the music's still the same." They fell back into conversation, and Bob found himself genuinely curious about Tommy's story. It emerged gradually, in fragments and glimpses, painted in the spaces between words, rather than in explicit detail. Tommy had been a medic in Vietnam, had seen things that no one should have to see, had come home to a country that didn't know what to do with its returning soldiers. He had tried to build a normal life, marriage, job, house in the suburbs, but the weight of his experiences had proven too heavy for the foundation of civilian existence. "It's not that I couldn't function," Tommy explained, his fingers absently picking out a minor melody on the guitar. "It's that I couldn't function the way everyone expected me to. Couldn't pretend that sitting in an office, worried about quarterly reports, mattered when I knew what real problems looked like. Couldn't make small talk about the weather when I had weather in my head that never cleared." The marriage had ended, not in anger but in quiet, mutual recognition that love alone wasn't enough to bridge the gap between who Tommy had been before the war and who he had become after it. The job had followed, then the house, then gradually all the structures that defined a conventional life. Some people might call it giving up, Tommy said. I call it finding a different way to live. Out here with the music, I don't have to pretend to be someone I'm not. I can just be who I am, right now, in this moment. Bob understood. He had spent decades trying to escape the expectations that came with success, the way fame could become a prison as confining as any other. The difference was that he had the luxury of choice. He could retreat to his farm or disappear into anonymity when the pressure became too much. Tommy had no such options. This was his reality, not a temporary escape from it. The music helps? Bob asked. The music is everything, Tommy replied without hesitation. It's the only thing that makes sense anymore. When I'm playing, I'm not a homeless vet or a social problem or any of the other labels people want to put on me. I'm just music, you know. Bob knew exactly what he meant. Music had always been his refuge, the place he could go to find clarity when the world became too complicated or demanding. But he had never needed it for basic survival the way Tommy did, had never had to depend on it as the sole source of meaning in his life. They talked until dawn began to creep over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of grey and pale orange. Sarah had brought them both coffee at some point, her face carefully neutral as she processed the unlikely scene of a famous musician sitting on her diner's steps, sharing conversation with the homeless veteran she had been quietly protecting for months. As the sun rose higher, Tommy began to pack up his guitar with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this ritual countless times. "Where will you go?" Bob asked. "There's a park about 2 miles from here," Tommy said, wrapping his instrument carefully in an old army blanket. "Good acoustics under the pavilion, and sometimes families bring their kids to hear music. Kids don't judge, you know. They just listen." Bob watched him prepare to leave, this man who had shared his story and his music with such generous honesty, who was about to disappear back into the anonymous margins of society. Something inside Bob rebelled against the idea, against the waste of talent and the casual cruelty of a world that could discard someone like Tommy simply because he didn't fit neatly into prescribed categories. "Tommy," Bob said, the words coming out before he had fully formed the thought behind them. "What if I told you I was working on some new songs and I could use someone to help me work out the arrangements, someone who understands music the way you do?" Tommy paused in his packing, his hands stilling on the guitar case. "I'd say you don't need to do that. I'm fine as I am." "I'm not talking about charity," Bob said quickly. "I'm talking about music, about collaboration, about the fact that you have something to offer that I can't find anywhere else." Tommy straightened up, his eyes searching Bob's face for signs of pity or false kindness. Finding none, he seemed to consider the offer seriously. "I don't have an address," he said finally. "Can't shower regular or dress proper or any of that." "Music doesn't care what you smell like," Bob replied, "and neither do I." Sarah had been watching from the doorway of the diner, and now she stepped forward with the expression that managed to be both hopeful and protective. "There's a room upstairs," she said quietly. "Nothing fancy, just a place I've been keeping for emergencies. If someone wanted to stay there for a while, work on music or whatever, I wouldn't charge much rent. Practically nothing, really." Bob and Tommy both looked at her in surprise. "I used to be married to a musician," she explained, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "Long time ago, before kids and responsibilities and all that. I know what it's like to need a place where you can make noise without bothering anyone." Tommy was quiet for a long moment, his calloused hands gripping the strap of his guitar case. Bob could see the internal struggle playing out across his weathered features, the desire to accept warring with pride, hope battling against the fear of disappointment that must have been a constant companion for someone in his position. "Why?" Tommy asked finally, addressing both of them. "Why would you do this for someone like me?" Sarah answered first, her voice soft but certain. "Because everyone deserves a chance to be heard. And because kindness doesn't cost anything, but the lack of it costs everything." Bob nodded in agreement. "And because the best music comes from real places, from people who have something genuine to say. You have that. That's not something you can buy or manufacture or learn in school. Tommy stood there in the growing daylight, a man caught between his past and the possibility of a different kind of future. Around them, the world was beginning to wake up. The distant sound of traffic increasing on the highway, the first few customers of the morning shift arriving at the diner, the ordinary bustle of people starting another day in their ordinary lives. But here, in this parking lot, with the smell of coffee and bacon grease and the faint lingering notes of guitar music in the air, something extraordinary was happening. Three people who might never have crossed paths under normal circumstances were creating a moment of genuine human connection, the kind that could change the trajectory of a life. "I'd want to pay my own way," Tommy said finally. "Whatever I can manage from playing, that goes toward rent and food. I won't be anybody's charity case." "Wouldn't have it any other way," Sarah said with a smile that transformed her tired face into something radiant. Bob felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. This was why he had gotten into music in the first place, not for the fame or the money or the critical acclaim, but for moments like this, when songs could build bridges between people who might otherwise remain strangers. "So what do you say?" Bob asked. "Want to make some music?" Tommy's smile was slow in coming, but when it arrived it lit up his entire face. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Yeah, I'd like that very much." The next few months passed in a blur of creative activity. Sarah's upstairs room became an unlikely recording studio filled with the sound of two guitarists working out harmonies and trading song ideas. Bob found himself spending more and more time at the diner, drawn not just by the music, but by the sense of community that had formed around it. Tommy proved to be everything Bob had hoped for as a collaborator. Intuitive, creative, and possessed of an emotional honesty that elevated every song they worked on together. His military experience had given him a unique perspective on themes that Bob had been exploring for decades: war, loss, the search for meaning in an increasingly complex world. But more than that, Tommy's presence grounded the music in a way that Bob hadn't experienced in years. Working with someone who had nothing to lose and everything to gain brought out a purity of purpose that was impossible to achieve in more commercial settings. They weren't making music to meet expectations or fulfill contracts. They were making music because they had to, because the songs demanded to be written and recorded and shared. Sarah became an unofficial third member of their creative partnership, offering feedback with the kind of honest directness that only came from someone who had no stake in the music industry's complex web of relationships and obligations. Her observations often cut straight to the heart of what a song was trying to accomplish, helping them identify when they were being too clever for their own good or when emotion was being sacrificed for technical perfection. The work was hard but fulfilling in a way that Bob had almost forgotten was possible. They would start early in the morning, while the diner was quiet, working through chord progressions and lyrical ideas over endless cups of Sarah's coffee. Sometimes they would play for the breakfast crowd, their acoustic guitars providing a soundtrack to conversations about farming and weather and local gossip. Word began to spread, as word always does in small towns. People started coming to the diner specifically to hear the music, drawn by reports of the homeless veteran and the mysterious stranger who seemed to know an awful lot about songwriting. Sarah found herself having to add extra shifts to accommodate the increased business, but she didn't complain. There was something magical happening in her establishment, and she was wise enough to recognize it. Tommy began to change, slowly but perceptibly. The haunted look never completely left his eyes, but it was joined by something else, a sense of purpose, of belonging, of being valued for who he was rather than judged for what he lacked. He started taking better care of himself, not out of vanity but out of self-respect. He began to tell stories about his time in Vietnam, not dwelling on the trauma, but sharing the moments of humanity that had sustained him through the darkness. "Music saved my life," he told Bob one afternoon as they sat on the diner's back steps, guitars in hand. "I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean, it literally saved my life. When I came back from overseas and everything fell apart, when I couldn't sleep or hold a job or even look at myself in the mirror, the only thing that kept me from ending it all was this guitar. He strummed a gentle chord, letting it ring in the autumn air. Every night I would play until my fingers bled, just to have something to focus on besides the noise in my head. And gradually the music started to organize the chaos, started to give me a way to make sense of what had happened to me. Bob understood. Music had served a similar function in his own life, though his struggles had been different in nature and scope. But the essential truth remained the same. Sometimes art was the only thing that stood between a person and complete despair. "What would you have done?" Bob asked, "if no one had ever listened, if you had spent the rest of your life playing to empty parking lots?" Tommy considered the question seriously. "I would have kept playing," he said finally, "because the music isn't really for other people, you know. I mean, it's nice when people listen and appreciate it, but that's not why I do it. I do it because I have to, because the songs are in me, and if I don't get them out, they'll eat me alive." This conversation took place on a Thursday in late October, with the leaves turning brilliant colors and the air carrying the first hints of the winter to come. Bob was supposed to be in Nashville that weekend for a recording session, but he found himself reluctant to leave this small pocket of creative paradise he had stumbled into. The recording session could wait. The music he was making here felt more important, more urgent than anything he had planned to do in a professional studio. This was raw and real and necessary in a way that most commercial music never managed to be. That evening, as they played for the dinner crowd, something extraordinary happened. Tommy was performing one of his own compositions, a haunting ballad about a soldier's letter home, when a young woman at one of the corner tables began to cry. Not the polite, restrained tears of someone moved by a performance, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from the very center of her being. Sarah approached the woman gently, offering tissues and quiet comfort. Through her tears, the story emerged. Her brother had died in Afghanistan 2 years earlier, and she had never been able to properly grieve, had never found a way to process the loss. Tommy's song had somehow given her permission to feel everything she had been holding inside. After the performance, she approached Tommy with shaking hands and tearful gratitude. "That song," she whispered. "It's like you knew him. It's like you knew exactly what he would have wanted to say." Tommy's eyes filled with tears of his own as he clasped her hands. "Music is the universal language," he said softly. "When we can't find the words, sometimes the songs find us." Bob watched this exchange from across the room, feeling a familiar tightness in his chest that always accompanied moments of genuine human connection. This was why music mattered, not because it entertained or distracted, but because it provided a way for people to recognize themselves in each other's stories. The woman's name was Jennifer, and she became a regular at the diner, often bringing friends and family members who had their own connections to military service or loss, or simply the universal human experience of trying to find meaning in difficult circumstances. Each person who listened seemed to find something different in the music, some reflection of their own journey that helped them feel less alone. As November turned to December, Bob realized that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of what it meant to be a musician. For too many years, he had been focused on the industry aspects of his career, the albums and tours and critical reception, the complex machinery of fame that often seemed to have very little to do with actual music making. But here, in this small-town diner, with a homeless veteran who had never played for more than a handful of people at a time, he had rediscovered the essential core of why he had started writing songs in the first place. It wasn't about reaching the largest possible audience or generating the most revenue or even creating the most technically perfect recordings. It was about connection, about the mysterious alchemy that happened when honest music met receptive hearts. The songs they were writing together were unlike anything Bob had created before. They were simpler in some ways, more direct and emotionally accessible. But they also possessed a depth and authenticity that came from being grounded in real experience rather than abstract concepts. Tommy's influence was evident in every aspect of the compositions. His military background brought a visceral understanding of conflict and loss. His time on the streets provided insight into the margins of society that most people never saw. His years of playing alone had taught him the value of every note, every silence, every moment when music could provide comfort or clarity. One song in particular, which they had titled Sarah's Diner, seemed to capture everything they had discovered about the power of small gestures and unexpected kindness. It told the story of a place where strangers could become friends, where music could heal old wounds, where the simple act of offering someone a cup of coffee could change the entire course of their life. The song was deceptively simple, just two guitars and two voices, with lyrics that painted pictures rather than making grand statements. But everyone who heard it seemed to recognize something essential about their own experience, their own moments of grace in unexpected places. "We should record this properly," Bob suggested one afternoon, as they finished working through a new arrangement. Tommy looked skeptical. "You mean in a studio? With all that equipment and people watching?" "I mean we should capture it the way it really sounds," Bob clarified. "Maybe not in a traditional studio, but somewhere we can get a clean recording that does justice to what we've created." Sarah overheard the conversation and made a suggestion that surprised both of them. "What about the church?" she said. "St. Michael's, just down the road. Father Murphy's been coming in here for his coffee for 15 years, and I know he'd let you use the sanctuary if you asked. The acoustics are beautiful, and it would be quiet." The idea appealed to Bob immediately. Churches had always been good places to record acoustic music. The high ceilings and stone walls created a natural reverb that no studio could truly replicate. And there was something appropriate about recording these particular songs in a sacred space, given how much they dealt with themes of redemption and human connection. Father Murphy turned out to be a music lover himself, a man in his 70s who had once played guitar in a folk group during his seminary days. He not only agreed to let them use the church, but offered to help with the recording process. Having some experience with simple recording equipment from years of documenting special services and events, they spent 3 days in the sanctuary of St. Michael's, working with a minimal setup, just a few carefully placed microphones and a digital recorder that could capture the full range and ambience of their acoustic instruments. The sessions felt more like extended prayers than commercial recording, with each song approached as a meditation on the themes it explored. Tommy was initially nervous about performing in such a formal setting, but he gradually relaxed as he realized that the church's acoustics actually enhanced the intimate quality of his playing rather than making it feel small or insignificant. His voice, weathered by years of outdoor performances and hard living, took on an almost hymn-like quality in the sacred space. Bob found himself thinking about the long tradition of music in religious contexts, about how the most powerful songs had always been those that spoke to the deepest questions of human existence. The music they were creating together seemed to fit naturally into this tradition, not because it was explicitly religious, but because it addressed the universal search for meaning and connection. The recording that emerged from those 3 days was unlike anything in Bob's extensive catalogue. It was raw and intimate, filled with the kind of emotional honesty that could only come from musicians who had nothing left to prove and everything to gain from simply telling the truth. Sarah's Diner was the centerpiece, but the album also included Tommy's military songs, some new compositions they had written together, and even a few traditional folk songs that had taken on new meaning in the context of their collaboration. Each track felt essential, as if it had been waiting to be recorded in exactly this way, in exactly this place, by exactly these people. When they finished, Bob knew they had created something special, but he wasn't sure what to do with it. The music was too personal and unconventional for his usual record label, too intimate for mainstream radio, too honest for the machinery of commercial promotion. Maybe it doesn't need to be released the traditional way, Tommy suggested when Bob shared his concerns. Maybe it just needs to exist, to be available for people who are looking for this kind of music. Sarah had her own idea. "What if we just started giving it away?" she said. "Burning CDs here at the diner, letting people take copies when they come to hear you play live. Let it spread naturally, the way music used to before all the industry stuff got involved." Bob was intrigued by the suggestion. In an era when the music business was increasingly focused on data analytics and targeted marketing, there was something appealing about returning to a more organic model of distribution. Let the music find its audience, rather than forcing it into predetermined categories and sales channels. They decided to try the experiment. Sarah invested in a small CD duplication setup, and they began making copies of the album to give away to diner customers. Word spread through the community and beyond, carried by people who had been moved by the music and wanted to share it with friends and family members who might find similar comfort in its messages. The response was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. People didn't just take the CDs, they listened to them repeatedly, shared them with others, and returned to the diner to talk about how specific songs had affected them. The music seemed to be filling a need that many people hadn't even realized they had, providing a soundtrack for experiences and emotions that were rarely addressed in commercial entertainment. Local radio stations began playing tracks from the album, not because they were being promoted by a record label, but because listeners were calling in to request them. Music bloggers discovered the project and wrote about it with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for major label releases. The album began to take on a life of its own, spreading through networks of communication that existed entirely outside the traditional music industry. Bob watched this organic growth with fascination and deep satisfaction. This was how music was supposed to work, not as a product to be manufactured and sold, but as a living thing that connected people to each other and to their own deepest experiences. Tommy was amazed by the response. "I never thought my songs could reach this many people," he told Bob one evening as they sat in the diner after closing time, counting the day's requests for CDs. "I mean, I always hoped someone would hear them and understand, but this is beyond anything I imagined." Sarah was equally moved by what was happening. Her diner had become a pilgrimage site of sorts, drawing visitors from hundreds of miles away who wanted to experience the music in its original setting. She had to hire additional staff to handle the increased business, but more importantly, she had discovered a renewed sense of purpose in her work. "It's like we created something bigger than any of us individually," she reflected. "The music, the place, the people who come here, it's all connected in ways I never expected." As winter deepened into spring, the project continued to evolve and grow. Bob found himself spending more and more time at the diner, drawn not just by the creative collaboration, but by the sense of community that had formed around the music. He rented a small apartment in town, officially making himself a resident of this place that had given him so much more than he had expected to find. Tommy's transformation continued as well. The success of the album had given him a new sense of self-worth, but more importantly, it had provided him with a platform to share his stories about veterans' experiences and the challenges faced by homeless individuals. He began speaking at local schools and community centers, using music as a way to bridge the gap between his world and the mainstream society that had once seemed so foreign to him. The three of them developed a routine that felt as natural and necessary as breathing. Morning coffee and conversation, afternoon songwriting sessions, evening performances for whoever happened to be in the diner. Each day brought new people, new stories, new opportunities for connection and understanding. One particularly memorable evening in April, A bus pulled up outside the diner and discharged 37 members of a church choir from Memphis who had driven 6 hours specifically to hear the music they had been reading about online. They filled the diner to capacity, singing along with songs they had learned from the album, turning the modest restaurant into an impromptu concert hall filled with voices raised in harmony. "This is what church should feel like," one of the choir members told Sarah afterward. "Not just the building or the ceremony, but this sense of people coming together around something that matters." Bob understood exactly what she meant. The diner had become a kind of secular sanctuary, a place where music served the same function that hymns and prayers served in more traditional religious settings. It provided a way for people to explore the big questions: mortality, meaning, connection, purpose, in a context that felt safe and welcoming. The success of the project eventually attracted attention from major media outlets, which presented both opportunities and challenges. Bob was accustomed to dealing with journalists and photographers, but he was protective of the intimate atmosphere they had created at the diner. Too much publicity could destroy the very thing that made the place special. After much discussion with Tommy and Sarah, they decided to accept a few carefully selected interviews, focusing on publications and programs that would treat the story with the respect and depth it deserved. The goal was to share their experience without turning it into a spectacle or a marketing opportunity. One of these interviews, with a respected music magazine, resulted in an article that perfectly captured the essence of what they had created. The journalist, a veteran music writer who had covered everyone from Elvis to Radiohead, wrote about the project with obvious admiration and understanding. Era when authentic musical experiences have become increasingly rare, Bob Dylan's collaboration with homeless veteran Tommy Martinez and diner owner Sarah Chen represents something genuinely revolutionary. This isn't a publicity stunt or a calculated career move. It's a return to the fundamental purpose of music as a force for human connection and healing. The album they recorded together, Songs from Sarah's Diner, strips away all the artifice and industry machinery that typically surrounds musical releases. These are songs born from real experience, performed by people who understand that music isn't entertainment, but necessity. When Dylan and Martinez play together, you hear the sound of two souls recognizing each other across the artificial boundaries that society creates. What makes this project so remarkable isn't just the quality of the music, though it ranks among Dylan's most emotionally honest work. It's the way the songs have created a community, transforming a small-town diner into a place where strangers become family, where wounds can begin to heal, where the simple act of listening becomes a form of communion. The article brought even more visitors to the diner, but somehow the increased attention didn't destroy the intimate atmosphere that made the place special. Sarah attributed this to the music itself, which seemed to create a protective bubble around anyone who truly listened to it. "The right people understand what this place is about," she explained to Bob one morning as they prepared for another day of unexpected visitors. "The ones who come here for the wrong reasons, just to gawk or take selfies or whatever, they don't last long. The music has a way of sorting people out, of attracting those who need to be here and gently discouraging those who don't." Tommy had his own theory about why the project continued to maintain its authenticity despite growing fame. "When you start with truth," he said, "it's hard to get lost in lies. The music keeps us honest, keeps us focused on what really matters." As summer arrived, they decided to expand their mission slightly by organizing a small festival in the town park, bringing together other musicians who shared their commitment to honest, emotionally direct music. They called it Songs for the Road, and it attracted performers and audiences from across the country who were hungry for the kind of authentic musical experience that seemed increasingly rare in commercial venues. The festival was deliberately kept small and uncommercial. There were no corporate sponsors, no merchandise booths, no separation between performers and audience. Musicians played on a simple stage constructed from plywood and borrowed sound equipment, with listeners sitting on blankets in the grass or folding chairs they had brought from home. Bob found himself remembering the early days of the folk revival, when music was a shared experience rather than a consumed product. The festival had that same feeling of community and common purpose, with everyone present because they believed in the power of music to create understanding and connection. Tommy performed several solo songs during the festival, his confidence as a performer having grown tremendously over the months. Watching him command the attention of hundreds of listeners, Bob felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with his own success or recognition. This was what mentorship was supposed to accomplish, not just teaching technical skills, but helping someone discover their own voice and the courage to use it. Sarah was everywhere during the festival, coordinating volunteers, solving logistical problems, and making sure every visitor felt welcomed and valued. She had discovered a talent for event organization that surprised everyone, including herself. "I guess I always knew how to take care of people," she reflected during a brief break in the action. "I just never had the opportunity to do it on this scale before." The festival's highlight came on the second evening when Bob and Tommy performed Sarah's Diner for an audience that included many of the people whose lives had been touched by the song. As they reached the final chorus, voices throughout the crowd joined in, creating a moment of collective musical expression that felt almost sacred in its power and beauty. Standing on that simple stage, surrounded by hundreds of people singing words that had emerged from their collaboration, Bob experienced one of those rare moments of perfect clarity about his purpose as an artist. This was why he had been given his gifts, not for fame or wealth or critical acclaim, but for moments like this, when music could serve as a bridge between human hearts. The festival became an annual tradition, growing slightly each year, but always maintaining its intimate, uncommercialized character. Musicians began to see an invitation to perform at Songs for the Road as a mark of authentic artistry, a recognition that their work served purposes deeper than entertainment or profit. As the second anniversary of their first meeting approached, Bob found himself reflecting on how profoundly his life had been changed by that chance encounter in a parking lot. The collaboration with Tommy had reinvigorated his creativity, but more importantly, it had reminded him of why he had become a musician in the first place. "I was lost," he admitted to Tommy during one of their afternoon songwriting sessions. "I had everything I thought I wanted, but I had forgotten what I actually needed. You reminded me that music isn't about the industry or the business or any of that external stuff. It's about connection. It's about truth. It's about using whatever gifts you have to help people feel less alone." Tommy nodded with understanding. "I was lost too," he said. "Lost in a different way, but lost all the same. Music found both of us, brought us together when we needed it most." Their third album together, The Road Home, reflected this mutual recognition of music's healing power. The songs explored themes of redemption, second chances, and the possibility of finding family among strangers. It was their most collaborative work yet, with Tommy contributing both lyrics and melodies to several tracks. The album's release followed the same organic model they had established with their first recording: CDs given away at the diner, word-of-mouth promotion, and gradual discovery by listeners who were drawn to authentic musical experiences. Once again, the response exceeded their expectations, with the music finding its way to people who needed its messages of hope and human connection. By this time, Tommy had become something of a local celebrity, but he wore his fame lightly, never forgetting the lessons learned during his years on the street. He used his platform to advocate for veterans' issues and homelessness, speaking at conferences and working with organizations that served marginalized populations. "Experience is the best teacher," he often said when asked about his advocacy work. "I know what it's like to be invisible, to have society write you off as a lost cause. Music taught me that everyone has value. Everyone has a story worth telling. Sarah had also found her life transformed by their collaboration. The success of the diner had allowed her to purchase the building and expand the space, but she had done so carefully, preserving the intimate atmosphere that made the place special. She had also begun writing her own songs, encouraged by Bob and Tommy to explore her own creative instincts. Her compositions were different from theirs, more introspective and domestic, focused on the small moments and quiet revelations that defined ordinary life. But they possessed their own power and beauty, adding another voice to the growing repertoire of music associated with the diner. "I never thought of myself as creative," she told Bob one evening as they worked on arrangements for one of her songs. "But I guess creativity isn't about being special or talented in some obvious way. It's about paying attention to life, about noticing the things that matter and finding ways to share them with others." Bob couldn't have agreed more. The most powerful art had always come from careful observation of human experience, from the willingness to look closely at life and report back honestly about what was discovered there. As their fourth year of collaboration began, the three of them had settled into a rhythm that felt both sustainable and continuously creative. They still spent their mornings talking over coffee, their afternoons working on new songs, their evenings sharing music with whoever happened to be present. But these routines never felt repetitive or constraining because each day brought new people, new stories, new opportunities for musical discovery. The diner had become a kind of informal institution, recognized by musicians and music lovers throughout the country as a place where authentic artistry was valued and nurtured. Young songwriters made pilgrimages there, hoping to learn from the example of artists who had managed to maintain their integrity in an increasingly commercial world. Bob often found himself in the role of elder statesman, sharing insights gleaned from decades of experience in the music industry. But he was careful to emphasize that the most important lessons couldn't be taught. They had to be lived, discovered through the process of creating music for the right reasons. "The business side of music will try to convince you that success is about numbers," he would tell aspiring musicians. "Album sales, concert attendance, chart positions. But real success is about connection. It's about writing a song that helps one person feel less alone, or performing music that brings a community together, or using your voice to speak for those who can't speak for themselves." Tommy had his own wisdom to share with visitors, particularly those who had experienced trauma or marginalization. His message was always one of hope, tempered by realism, the acknowledgement that healing was possible but never easy, that music could provide comfort but couldn't solve all problems, that finding your voice was a lifelong process rather than a single moment of discovery. "Music saved my life," he would tell them, but it didn't happen overnight. It took years of playing alone in parking lots, years of people walking past without listening, years of believing in something I couldn't prove. But eventually, the right people heard, and everything changed. The key is to keep playing, keep believing, even when nobody seems to be listening. Sarah's role had evolved as well. In addition to running the diner and managing the logistics of their various projects, she had become a kind of curator of the stories that emerged from their work. She kept detailed records of the people who visited, the songs that moved them, the ways their lives were changed by the music they encountered. "Every person who comes through that door has a story," she explained to a documentary filmmaker who was creating a film about their project. "My job is to make sure those stories are heard, valued, treated with respect. Music brings people together, but it's the stories that create lasting connections." The documentary, when it was finally released, captured something essential about what they had created together. Rather than focusing on Bob's celebrity or the feel-good aspects of their collaboration, it explored the deeper questions raised by their work, about community, about the purpose of art, about the ways authentic relationships could form across social and economic boundaries. The film's most powerful moment came during an interview with Jennifer, the young woman who had been so moved by Tommy's military songs during one of their early performances. She had since become a regular at the diner, eventually meeting her future husband at one of their informal concerts. "That song changed my life," she said, tears streaming down her face as she remembered her first encounter with Tommy's music. "Not in some dramatic way, but in the way that really matters. It gave me permission to grieve, to feel everything I had been holding inside, and in feeling that grief, I found my way back to joy." This was the real measure of their success, not in industry awards or commercial metrics, but in the individual lives that had been touched, the personal transformations that had occurred, the communities that had formed around their shared commitment to honest musical expression. As their 5th year together began, Bob realized that this collaboration had become the defining work of his later career. Not because it was his most commercially successful or critically acclaimed project, but because it represented the fullest expression of his values as an artist and human being. The music they continued to create together was evolving, becoming more sophisticated in its arrangements while maintaining its emotional directness. They had developed an almost telepathic understanding of each other's musical instincts, able to anticipate harmonic changes and melodic directions with the kind of precision that only came from years of intensive collaboration. Their 4th album, Common Ground, explored themes of reconciliation and shared humanity. The songs addressed some of the most divisive issues of contemporary life: economic inequality, political polarization, cultural conflict, but always from a perspective that emphasized commonality rather than division. "We're all more alike than different," Tommy observed during one of their songwriting sessions. "People get so focused on the things that separate us that they forget about all the experiences we share. Everyone's been hurt, everyone's been disappointed, everyone's looking for connection and meaning. Music reminds us of those shared experiences." The album's title track became their most requested song, a gentle meditation on the possibility of finding understanding across seemingly insurmountable differences. Radio stations across the country began playing it during their news programs, using it as a bridge between stories about conflict and controversy. "Music has always been a unifying force," Bob reflected during a radio interview about the album. "When people sing together, they remember what they have in common. They remember that we're all part of the same human family, all struggling with the same basic questions about how to live meaningful lives." The interview took place at the diner, with the sounds of ordinary conversation and coffee preparation providing a backdrop to their discussion. This had become their preferred setting for media appearances, keeping everything grounded in the real-world context that had given birth to their collaboration. As they talked, regular customers came and went, some stopping to listen to the conversation, others simply going about their daily routines. The ordinariness of the setting was itself part of the message, that profound artistic work didn't require special venues or artificial environments, but could emerge from the most common circumstances when approached with the right spirit. The interviewer, initially skeptical about conducting a serious music discussion in such an informal setting, gradually came to appreciate the wisdom of the choice. The diner's atmosphere of casual warmth and genuine community provided the perfect context for understanding what made their collaboration so special. "This isn't just about music," he observed at the end of the interview. "This is about a different way of living, a different set of priorities. You've created something here that challenges a lot of assumptions about how art relates to commerce, how success should be measured, how communities can form around shared values." Bob nodded in agreement. "That's exactly right. We're not trying to reject the modern world, but we are trying to demonstrate that there are alternatives to the way things usually work. You can make music for the right reasons. You can build authentic relationships. You can create something valuable without exploiting anyone or compromising your principles. As autumn arrived again, marking the beginning of their 6th year together, the 3 collaborators took time to reflect on what they had accomplished and where they wanted to go next. The project had grown far beyond anything they had initially imagined, but it had maintained its core values of authenticity, community, and service to something larger than individual ambition. "Sometimes I think about that first night," Tommy said during one of their morning conversations. "When I was sitting out there in the parking lot, just playing for nobody in particular. If someone had told me then that it would lead to all this, the albums, the festival, the people who've been touched by the music, I would have thought they were crazy." Sarah smiled, refilling their coffee cups with the automatic grace that had become second nature over the years. "I think the best things in life usually happen that way," she said. "Not because we plan them or try to make them happen, but because we're open to possibility, willing to take small risks, ready to recognize opportunity when it presents itself." Bob found himself thinking about all the chance encounters and unexpected turns that had shaped his own career, the way seemingly random events had led to lasting relationships and important creative breakthroughs. But this collaboration felt different from those earlier experiences, more intentional in some ways, more grounded in conscious choices about values and priorities. "I think we've proved something important," he said, watching the morning light stream through the diner's windows. "We've proved that you can make meaningful art without sacrificing your integrity, that you can build success without losing your soul, that you can create community around shared values rather than shared consumption." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their first customers of the day, a family of 4 traveling cross-country who had detoured specifically to visit the diner they had read about online. The parents were musicians themselves, members of a community choir in Oregon who had been performing their songs at local concerts. "We wanted our children to understand what authentic music sounds like," the mother explained as they settled into a corner booth. "Everything they hear on the radio or streaming services is so produced, so manufactured. We wanted them to experience music the way it's supposed to be, intimate, honest, connected to real human experience." Their children, twins about 8 years old, listened with wide-eyed attention as Bob and Tommy performed an impromptu acoustic set during the lunch hour. The songs seemed to transport them to a different world, one where music served purposes deeper than entertainment or background noise. "That was like a story," one of the children said afterward, "but told with guitar sounds instead of words." Her observation delighted everyone within earshot, capturing something essential about the narrative power of instrumental music when performed with genuine emotion and skill. These kinds of encounters had become daily occurrences, each one reinforcing their sense that the work they were doing served a genuine need in people's lives. In an increasingly fragmented and digitized world, the diner offered something that couldn't be replicated through technological means: the irreplaceable experience of live music performed by people who cared more about connection than commercial success. As winter approached, they began planning their most ambitious project yet, a collaboration with the local school district to create a music education program that emphasized creativity and authentic expression over technical perfection and competition. The program would bring professional musicians into classrooms, not as performers, but as collaborators, working with students to help them find their own musical voices. "Too much music education focuses on getting the notes right," Tommy observed during one of their planning meetings. "But the most important thing about music isn't technical perfection. It's emotional honesty. It's having something to say and finding the courage to say it." Bob agreed completely. He had seen too many technically proficient musicians who lacked any genuine emotional connection to their material, and too many authentic voices who had been discouraged from pursuing music because they didn't meet conventional standards of technical excellence. The best musicians I've ever worked with weren't necessarily the most skilled, he said. They were the ones who understood that music is a language for expressing things that can't be expressed any other way. That's what we need to teach, not just how to play instruments, but how to use music as a tool for understanding yourself and connecting with others. Sarah's contribution to the education program drew from her years of observing how music affected the diverse range of people who visited the diner. She had developed an intuitive understanding of how different types of songs resonated with different personalities and life experiences. Every person responds to music differently, she explained to the teachers who would be participating in the program. Our job isn't to impose our musical preferences on students, but to help them discover what kinds of music speak to their own experiences and interests. Some kids will connect with folk songs, others with blues, others with classical or world music. The key is exposing them to authentic examples of each tradition. The pilot program launched in January with 50 students from 3 different schools. Rather than focusing on any particular instrument or musical style, the classes encouraged experimentation and exploration, with professional musicians serving as guides rather than instructors. Bob found himself working primarily with high school students who were dealing with the typical challenges of adolescence: identity confusion, social pressure, family conflict, academic stress. Music provided them with a safe space to explore these issues and express emotions that might otherwise remain bottled up inside. Tommy gravitated toward middle school students, many of whom reminded him of his younger self, caught between childhood and adulthood, struggling to understand their place in an often confusing world. His own experience with trauma and recovery gave him special insight into the ways music could serve as a coping mechanism and healing tool. Sarah worked with elementary students, helping them discover the joy of musical expression before self-consciousness and comparison with others could inhibit their natural creativity. Her approach emphasized play and exploration, allowing children to experience music as a source of pure fun and self-expression. The results exceeded everyone's expectations. Students who had shown little interest in traditional music classes came alive when given the freedom to explore music that connected with their own experiences and interests. Academic performance improved across the board, as did social relationships and overall mental health indicators. Music gives them a language for things they can't express any other way, one participating teacher observed during a program evaluation meeting. I've watched shy students become confident performers, seen isolated kids make friends through shared musical interests, witnessed troubled students find healthy ways to process difficult emotions. The success of the pilot program led to its expansion throughout the school district, and eventually to adoption by other communities that had heard about their innovative approach to music education. What had started as a local experiment became a model for educational reform that emphasized creativity and authenticity over standardization and competition. As their 6th year together drew to a close, Bob found himself amazed by the scope of what they had accomplished. What had begun as a chance encounter between 2 musicians had grown into a movement that touched thousands of lives and challenged fundamental assumptions about how music should be created, distributed, and valued. But the real measure of their success wasn't in the numbers or the recognition or the institutional changes they had inspired. It was in the individual moments of connection and understanding that happened every day, in the diner, in classrooms, at the annual festival, and wherever their music was heard by people who needed its messages of hope and human dignity. We've built something that will outlast all of us, Bob reflected during one of their evening conversations. Not just the songs or the albums, but the community, the approach, the proof that authentic art can thrive in an authentic environment. Tommy nodded, his fingers absently picking out a melody on his ever-present guitar. "Music is immortal," he said. Long after we're gone, these songs will still be helping people feel less alone, still be bringing communities together, still be proving that kindness and creativity are more powerful than cynicism and competition. Sarah looked around the diner that had become the unlikely center of their shared mission. "Sometimes I think about what this place was like before you two started playing here," she said. "It was just a restaurant. A good one, maybe, but nothing special. Now, it's something more. A place where magic happens on a regular basis, where strangers become friends, where music serves its highest purpose." As they sat together in the warm light of the diner, surrounded by the memorabilia and photographs that documented their years of collaboration, all three felt a deep sense of satisfaction and gratitude. They had found each other at exactly the right moment, when each of them needed what the others could provide. Together, they had created something beautiful and lasting, something that honored the best possibilities of human connection and artistic expression. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering the parking lot where Tommy had once played alone for hours at a time. But the diner was warm and welcoming, filled with the kind of music that reminded everyone present that they were part of something larger than themselves, something worthy of their best efforts and deepest commitments. The story of their collaboration would continue for years to come, inspiring other musicians to seek authentic connections with their communities, encouraging other venues to prioritize artistic integrity over commercial profit, and proving to anyone who cared to listen that the most powerful music still emerged from the most human places. And every morning, as the sun rose over the small town that had become the center of their shared universe, the three collaborators would gather for coffee and conversation, ready to make music together for whoever needed to hear it, grateful for the chance encounter that had changed all their lives in ways they were still discovering. Never underestimate the power of a kind heart or the magic that can happen when authentic artists find each other in the most unlikely places. Sometimes, the most important music is made not in famous studios or concert halls, but in small diners where strangers become family and songs become prayers for a better world. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to share it with someone who might need to hear its message. Like and subscribe to support authentic storytelling, and leave a comment sharing your own experiences with the transformative power of music.